Such a pleasure to be back. How many of you were here yesterday? Oh, look at all those hands. Wonderful. How many of you just came in today? Brand new today. Okay, very good. Welcome, by the way. I'm glad that you're here. There will be just a few slides that are repeated from my keynote yesterday, but very few. I promise you this is largely new information. So as Usha said, my name is Scott Davis. I run a consultancy called ThirstyHead.com. And for a large part of my professional career, I have been a server-side Java developer. My very first book was JBoss at Work. As a matter of fact, I am in the process of upgrading that right now, working with a couple of co-authors. We should have a second edition of JBoss at Work out sometime next year. After Java, I spent quite a bit of time in Groovy and Grails. And Groovy runs top Java, and it's very nice, but it's still server-side development. And so even many of the questions I was getting here before the presentation today were from Java developers who were talking about how can I do mobile development? How can I integrate what you were talking about yesterday with responsive web design and things like that? How can I integrate that with my Java development? And so I'm going to give you two different frameworks that you can use. I'm going to be talking about Backbone in this session, and then at the very end of the day, I'll be talking about jQuery Mobile. But what you have to realize is both of these frameworks, Backbone and jQuery Mobile, are very different than the kind of web development you're probably used to doing. Because we're no longer on the server side anymore. Both Backbone and jQuery Mobile are client-side MVC frameworks. And so these talks, Backbone and jQuery, even if you're not going to use them, both of them are going to help you get in the mindset of client-side MVC development versus server-side MVC development. Does that make sense? Where I got started with this is at Time Warner Cable. I started with them on a 6-week contract back in 2010, in the year 2010. I'm still with them working on that 6-week contract. That's good work if you can get it. They brought me and my team on to help them prepare a demo for CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. Their CEO was going to be up on stage clicking buttons around. And they said, we don't have to show real software. This is just for a demo. So they said this can literally be monkeys on roller skates behind the scenes. But it needs to be something that our CEO can reach out with a remote control and click, click, click. So our original 6-week process was to write monkeys on roller skates. And then all this time we've been turning around now and turning it into a real product. And why I was so excited about this project is because it was running on a Samsung TV. And the back end was not JBoss. The back end was not Tomcat or even Apache. The back end was a cable set-top box. Time Warner Cable, every single one of their cable set-top boxes is a RESTful endpoint that returns JSON. We can send an HTTP GET request to the cable set-top box and it says, this is what is currently showing on the channel this TV is tuned to. We can say, well, tell me all of the television shows, and it will return JSON for an electronic program guide. We can say, show me all of the recorded content on the set-top box, and it'll return JSON of all your DVR content. Show me all the video on demand. You get the idea. This is a pure REST JSON-based background. And it was a Samsung TV talking to that. The Samsung TV doesn't have a JVM on it, but the Samsung TV does have a WebKit browser with JavaScript support. So this was my first experience being forced to do pure client-side JavaScript MVC development. And it really forces you to reconsider a lot of truths that you held very near and dear to your heart as a server-side developer. I said this yesterday, and I want to say this again. Even though we were doing development on a 60-inch smart TV, it had 100 times the screen real estate of a smartphone and 1/100th of the CPU power. But the principles remain the same. So whereas you have been doing most likely server-side web development targeted at desktop browsers, if you want to do development that skews towards tablets and mobile phones, or you want to do development that skews towards smart TVs, I'm not saying you can't do that using the techniques you already know. But both smart TV development and smartphone development tend to skew towards these client-side MVC frameworks. Fair enough? Yeah? Excellent. So we're definitely going to show you lots of good source code for Backbone. But before we do, I want to establish some architectural patterns. And again, we'll establish them here in Backbone. And if you hear me talk about jQuery Mobile at the end of the day, these same patterns will apply. We are now doing the same MVC development you're used to, except it's client-side. So if we take a look at what Backbone says, they say, well, wonderful, Backbone is a web framework. It gives structure to your web applications. It provides models, just like you would expect. As a Java developer, you're going to write your model in Java. It's going to be a POJO, right? A plain old Java object, a Java bean with getters and setters. In the case of Backbone, it's going to be implemented in JavaScript. And what you'll find, especially if you were driving this based on RESTful JSON APIs, your model is going to be empty. It's literally going to be a bucket that you can pour that JSON into. This will make more sense when we demonstrate it in code. You still have models, but your models are going to be considerably lighter than what you're used to doing server-side development. Now, what's interesting is Backbone brings collections to the party as well. Now, collections are really your DAOs, your data access objects. Your models are more your DTOs, your data transfer objects. What we're going to find are your collections, or just as the name implies, how we're going to deal with a whole bunch of things. So in Time Warner Cable, we deal with assets. We can think of them as TV shows, but we have to call them assets because they could also be sporting events. They could also be movies. They could be a number of things. So we generically consider them assets. Those are your individual models, an individual asset. But how do I get all of the assets that are playing on a particular TV station? How do I get all the movies that are playing on HBO? How do I get all of the football games that are playing on ESPN right now? That would be handled through a collection. And your collection is what's going to make that HTTP GET request. Now, your collection is made up of a series of models, so your collection is what's going to asynchronously get the JSON back, and it's going to populate those models and store them in lists. So we've got models and collections. We also have views. The views you're probably used to dealing with are JSPs, Java server pages, ASPs, active server pages, GSPs, Groovy server pages, PHP, Ruby on Rails, all those things are server-side templated. You're going to have mostly HTML with plug points where you're going to dynamically inject your code. We have the same templating going on, but it's not going to be done through ASPs or JSPs or GSPs or anything else. These are going to be client-side templates. And the nice thing is, Backbone is completely agnostic about what client-side templating you use. As we're going to see in just a moment, you get underscore templates for free. But if you don't like underscore templates and you'd prefer to use handlebars, you can use that. If you'd prefer to use mustache templates, you can use that. If you'd prefer to use jQuery templates, you can do that. So you are going to be doing client-side templating, but the library you choose to use is completely pluggable. So we've talked about our models. We've talked about our views. This is the MV. We've got to talk about our Cs. The Cs are not collections. When you're doing server-side development, they're typically called controllers. Model View Controller, MVC. Now we have MVCs up here, and Backbone used to call them controllers, but they decided to be clever and call it a router. So you can see this is an MVR framework, but know what you're talking about. We can still call it an MVC framework because we have models, we have views, and we have counters. Yeah, we have a router at least, but that is acting in the role of your controller. Does that make sense? Yeah. And this is Backbone at the end of the day. The reason it's called Backbone is it's meant to be a bare bones framework. It really has nothing to do with validation. It really has nothing to do with videos. It really has nothing to do with any of those other things. All Backbone is meant to do is give you the most basic model view controller so you can turn around and decorate it with whatever you want. Shoot, Backbone can't even make AJAX requests out of the box. You have to include jQuery or YUI tools or Moo tools or any of these kinds of things. So Backbone is an incredibly light framework, which is what makes it so appealing to me. By light, I mean it's 5K. Now, how many of you do jQuery development? How big is the jQuery library? We don't like talking about it, do we? It does an awful lot, and it should at about 150K. It is truly the kitchen sink of JavaScript web frameworks at this point. Now, I'm not knocking jQuery by any stretch, but from a mobile perspective, when we're trying to stream things over a 3G network, we do get very sensitive to large libraries. And so this is an arbitrary rule. This is an arbitrary line in the sand. But if you're doing mobile development, if your library is about 4K, that's a good size for a library. If your library is 140K, you ought to reconsider. So yesterday, when we were talking about how pervasive WebKit is in the mobile scenario, WebKit is the HTML render kit used by iOS devices, so iPhones, iPods, iPads. WebKit is what's used for all Android devices, both smartphones and tablets. WebKit is what's used for Amazon Kindles. It's used for Bada. It's used for RIM. It's used for virtually all of those libraries, virtually all those devices. So whereas jQuery is trying to help you shellac over the differences among browsers, jQuery is to help you to move from IE to Firefox to Chrome. Those are three different HTML render kits. Trident for IE, Gecko for Firefox, WebKit for Chrome and Safari. That's why jQuery is 150K. It's a very large library. It's trying to do quite a bit. It's trying to help you write once and run it across a number of different browsers. There's a library out there called Zepto. Has anyone here heard of Zepto or played with it? Absolutely. Zepto is API compatible with jQuery. All of the same calls you can make in jQuery, you can make in Zepto. The only difference is Zepto is 4K. jQuery is 140K. Why do we have that dramatic reduction in size? It's because Zepto is targeted solely at WebKit browsers. And so if you want to know the delta between 4K and 140K, that is exactly how much code it takes to support every browser on the planet versus just WebKit browsers. Yeah? So if you are doing Backbone development and you want to target desktop browsers as well as smart TVs, as well as tablets and mobile, continue to use jQuery. There's no problem with that at all. If you are just focusing on mobile devices, and you know that you are just dealing with WebKit browsers, you can use Backbone, which is roughly 4K. and Zepto, which is roughly 4K. And Zepto will give you all of the things you'd expect out of jQuery, being able to make AJAX requests and good things like that. The only other library we have to deal with is underscore. And so these are our requirements right now. Backbone is what gives us MVC. jQuery or Zepto is what gives us AJAX. And then underscore is what gives us a number of different utility libraries. In our case, it's going to give us templating. If we have these 3 4K libraries, we're ready to begin. Does that make sense? Yeah? Excellent. So I am going to show you code, but I want to talk about the architecture of this app. So I promise you I will show you live working code, but let's make sure you understand what you're looking at. Because again, there's not a whole lot of code going on. The code is not difficult. The concepts can be difficult, especially if you're a server-side developer. So I want to talk about 4 things before I show you source code. The first thing I want to talk about is the difference between a multi-page app and a single-page app. And I think you already know the answer to this. You're a smart bunch, right? You could probably figure that out. But let me belabor the point anyway, because that's what I get paid to do up here. I get paid by the word, so I need to pad my content. Server-side development, it makes perfect sense to have each individual page stored in an individual HTML file, or an individual ASP file, or JSP file, or GSP file. We know that as you click on links, you're doing those coarse-grained request-response cycles. If it pulls up index and I click on a link for grid, I download all of grid. And if I click on list from there, I download all of list as I go along, right? That's a lot of round-tripping back and forth. Now, most client-side apps will try to minimize that round-tripping. So in fact, what they will do is they will download all pages, and I have to say pages in air quotes, because in fact, it's a single page application. Every page in air quotes is in fact a div that you show and hide selectively, probably using jQuery or Zepto. Does that make sense? So what you're dealing with now is a single page app that has individual divs that the framework is going to show and hide. It's so common to talk about pages that we could say, well, that's the index page and the grid page and the details page in there. But I like thinking of it in terms of state transitions. That's something I'm bringing to the party. That's not Backbone nomenclature. But I like talking about state transitions because it really helps keep me in the mindset that this is a single page app and I'm just in different states. Yeah? Cool. So the second thing is whether you're dealing with server-side MVC or client-side MVC. Very quickly, if I am sitting on a client, and let's say I'm in a search engine and I'm searching for articles on JavaScript, what I'm going to generate is an HTTP GET request up to the server, right? And if you're using a server-side MVC, it's the controller that grabs that request off the wire. It most likely reaches out to a database to create a model, or in the case of something like this, an array list of models. Now, it doesn't have to go to a database. We know that it could go to the file system. It could go to a NoSQL database. It could make pure web services calls behind the scenes. But for our simplified example here, the controller is what's gotten the request off the wire. It round trips to the database to materialize the list of models. It passes the models to the view, that's our template. And it builds up all the HTML. All this is happening synchronously server-side. So when the request comes in, everything is built up dynamically. And it is the result, that search.html page or results.html page, that comes back down. But we call this server-side because It's all happening server-side, right? Yeah. You're a smart bunch. You can figure this stuff out. You don't need me here. So what does it mean then to be a client-side MVC framework? I'll give you one guess. What happens first is your request doesn't round trip to the server like we discussed. It goes to an internal div. And most of the time, these requests begin with a hash. Now, you've seen this in use in a number of different places. Let's say we go to Wikipedia and we search on JavaScript right here. Now, notice that there's kind of a table of contents. And so if I was interested in the features of JavaScript, notice what that did to my URL. I went to hash features. Did that generate a new HTTP request? No. It just went to an internal div in here. So if I wanted to know about the history, I could go to the history. If I wanted to know about features, I got to spell it correctly. Features, there we go. I go internally right here. So this has been around since the beginning of time, being able to link to internal divs. Wikipedia is doing exactly what we're doing here. The only difference is it's not showing and hiding those divs. It's just scrolling the page. So when I do something like this hash search, we know what's going on. It's going someplace internally rather than generating new GET requests. Where it's going is to a controller. Except Backbone got clever and they decided to call it a router. But I really am okay with that. Because router really is evocative of what it's doing, isn't it? You've got this JavaScript on the client side that's saying, oh, well, he wants to search or she wants to query or he wants to go over here. And so you have a router that's doing whatever it needs to do. It's your router that will selectively show and hide the divs. But in our search example here, it's the router that might, in fact, round trip to the server. But there's a subtle but important difference here. What's being sent back to the client from that GET request is not a fully decorated HTML page. It's just pure data. It's just the AJAX request and we're getting JSON back. Your router now is what is creating the collection and the models. And your router is what's going to hand that off to some client-side templating library and turn around and display it to the client. So even though we're talking about Backbone right here with laptops and a server, can you imagine this being a Samsung TV and that being a cable set-top box and seeing what we're getting accomplished here? Yeah? Outstanding. Outstanding. Well, the third thing we want to focus on now is moving from being page-centric to component-oriented. And here's what I mean by this. Now, this is clearly pseudocode up here. But if I were building this server-side, what I would do is I would call the build page function, and I would say, all right, I need to write out all those categories. I would go along here and I would build up all of this synchronously, and then I would build out that grid view synchronously. I would iterate through all this stuff. I would build it up all server-side and hand the page down to the client. Right? Now that's what I mean by page-centric. You're thinking in very coarse-grained HTTP GET requests returning an entire page. What it means to be component-oriented is you start thinking of these as components. What a concept. So this is what your code would look like. You would literally new up a sidebar, you would new up a movie list, and you're done. You now have a sidebar that has its own life cycle, that can be making its own AJAX requests. You have a movie list that is its own freestanding component that knows how to render itself on the page, it knows how to make the AJAX requests, and those two are completely independent of each other. And if you wanted to do something like click on comedy on the sidebar and have it update the movie list, you would do something like this. You would add event listeners. You would say on the click event, I want movie list to update. Does that make sense? This is one of the biggest, hardest changes for me to make, was moving from this page-centric view that every single server-side framework forces you into. Because of the life cycle, HTTP GET, return an entire page. Every single server-side framework is going to force you to think of this in terms of coarse-grained pages. But because we are client-side, we want to take a more component-oriented approach. Yesterday when I was talking about small pieces loosely joined, do you see what I'm talking about now? If I want to have a PayPal button, that's a component. If I want to have a Google map, that is a freestanding component. If you've ever done any Google map development, you say var map equals new map, and that's it. That Google map is responsible for rendering itself on the screen and round-tripping to the server, downloading additional tiles, all those kinds of things. So we need to take a very component-oriented approach to development. And the last thing we need to talk about, and then we'll show you some source code, is the move from synchronous to asynchronous. And this is going to be a difficult one for you to get your arms around as well. Because if you are getting a GET request on the server side, you are going to synchronously build up that page. You're not going to send the page down until you've gathered all the details up on the server side. You're going to synchronously reach out to your database and perform that query. And only when you get a result set are you going to begin building up an HTML fragment. And only after that HTML fragment is built up are you going to inject it into the page and then return it back to the client. So it's easy to do development because you can say, well, I'm going to go step 1 and step 2 and step 3 and step 4 and step 5. Step 1 is I'm going to paint out the header, and then step 2 is I'm going to query the database, and then step 3 is I'm going to build out the results, and step 4 I'm going to paint out the footer, and step 5 is send the whole thing back down to the client. But you don't send it down to the client until you have finished all 5 steps in sequence. When you take a component-oriented view of things, every one of the components on the page is going to have its own life cycle. Every single one of the components on the page is going to be making its own AJAX request, and those AJAX requests are going to come back at staggered intervals. So you can't do this simple step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order anymore. What you have to do is get into an event-driven mindset. And even though this is still pseudocode, this is beginning to look a whole lot more like Backbone. And after this, I'm going to show you actual code. But this is a nice, gentle introduction to everything we've been talking about. So notice I have a collection up there, a Backbone collection. I named it Movie List. And that movie list has a model. And that movie list has a URL. We'll talk more about this, but this is going against a YouTube API. A RESTful API will make HTTP GET requests and get JSON back. But that's what our collection looks like. Our collection is solely responsible for making AJAX requests and building up a list of models. That's all it does. A view is meant to iterate through that collection and render it to the screen. So we can see what happens in initialize, which is the constructor for a Backbone view. It is going to add an event listener. So I've got a collection over here that's going to make an AJAX request. I've got a view over here, and I've bound these two together in the constructor of the view. But what I've told that view to do is when your collection triggers the reset event, then I want you to call the add-all method. And the add-all method is going to iterate through the list and render that kind of thing. So when I new up my movie list, and I new up my view and I pass in the movie list to the constructor. And then I call movie list fetch. Do you see how I have all the pieces in motion at this point? But this is done asynchronously, not synchronously. So Backbone is a single-page client-side MVC component-oriented asynchronous web framework. Does that make sense? Holy cow. Yeah. All right. Well, now that we have the architectural underpinnings in place, let's turn around and look at some live working code. Now, this code is a project I've affectionately called Backtube. It is a YouTube Backbone mashup. I'm using Backbone as the client-side MVC, and I'm using YouTube as the data source. I named it Backtube because Ubone would be unpolite, wouldn't it? But if you want to see this code, you can find me on GitHub, ScottDavis99. You can check it out. I'll be updating it periodically. It will probably never be a fully fleshed out app. I say right here, this is just my effort to demonstrate these two things. So I'm never focused on great looking production code. I want it to be bare bones so you can see the moving parts. So let's see the moving parts. This is what Backtube ends up looking like. Backtube is making a request to YouTube. YouTube has videos, full-fledged videos. And so being able to come in here and view individual movies based on making a request to YouTube is what I'm trying to get accomplished. Notice that I have one collection that's responsible for making those AJAX requests, but I have 3 different views rendering that same content in different ways. Yeah? All right. Show me the source code. This is an HTML5 app. In order for these things to work, I need to include jQuery, I need to include underscore, and I need to include Backbone. So those are the only 3 requirements I have in place. All of my code is in a file called backtube.js. I've got it up right here. We'll take a look at this. We'll talk about routers in just a moment here. But I also wanted to show you that I've got some templates in place. These templates, as you can tell, are underscore templates. But this is just because underscore is a requirement. You might as well use these things. But if you wanted to use a different set of templating libraries, you can plug in anything you want to. At the end of the day, on my document ready, I'm going to new up a list. I'm going to new up a view and pass that list into the view. I'm going to new up a sidebar. I'm going to new up my router. And I'm going to start. Yeah, a very component-oriented approach. And you can see the HTML itself is almost non-existent. All I've done is I've created a couple of divs, used sections here just to prove this is HTML5. You can use divs as well. A couple of named divs, and these are where the components are going to inject their content. So these are the basic pieces we have in place. jQuery underscore backbone, my own custom JavaScript, a couple of templates, and a skeleton. Backbone, skeleton. All right, you get it. All right, so let's talk about routers to begin with. Routers are simply a named hash map of arrays. So these guys are what we're going to plug into the URL, and then we've got functions that are turning around and doing something with it. So what this means is I should have a route called comedy. Let's see if in fact I do. Can I come up here and say hash comedy? Indeed, I can. You can see it says I'm now watching a comedy. So being able to route around in here is just as simple as saying, well, here is what I want the named route to be. So if I wanted to create a GIDS route, I would hand it off to something. This is a naming convention I've created, GIDS and GIDS handler. It can be named anything we want. But down here, here's my GIDS handler, which is a function which will do something interesting. How do you get... Oh, except we're not in GIDS, are we? This is the Mobile Developer Summit. There we go. It's very important, isn't it, that we get these things correct. All right. MDS. MDS. There we go. So that's my named route. This is my handler. Here's my handler, and it's going to say all that. So with that in place, I'm going to do a quick refresh. I'm now watching a comedy. Howdy, MDS. Yeah? So routers are just that straightforward. Nothing too special going on there. So let's talk about models and collections then. Models and collections. As I said, this model is empty. Now, Backbone models do have the ability to do validation. Backbone models do have the ability to supply default values. Backbone models do have the ability to do quite a number of different things. But in this example here, this model is as empty as I possibly can make it. Because when I make that AJAX request to YouTube, I'm just going to pour that JSON into this model, and that model is going to poof appear. The documentation for Backbone is really quite good. So if we come in here and we start looking at Backbone, we can see that the model has all kinds of things that we can do. This is where it discusses the constructor. This is where it discusses the defaults. So I could have my model say, all right, here are going to be the default values. And so the dessert will be when I come on back. There's the model. There are my defaults. So when I new up that model, if I immediately get the dessert, I'll be eating cheesecake if I don't specify otherwise. Are you with me on that? Yeah. So the online documentation is incredibly nice, but our model is as simple as it can be. We're just going to pour JSON into it. Now, what does that JSON end up looking like? Well, this is what the request is going to be. When I make a request to YouTube, I'm going to get some metadata like this, but then I have an items array. And that items array is going to have an ID and a title, Talladega Nights, and a description, a whole bunch of content. And then here's my next, life in a day. Here's my next one. Oh boy, they're all lumped together here. But we can see that this is what's going on. This is what my model is going to end up containing. All these name value pairs I get passed down from the JSON. So my collection needs to know what the model is going to be and how to get its hands on it. You can see for my purposes here, I'm just pointing it up to this stubbed out data right here. But this is what the URL would end up looking like if I really did want a round trip to the server. And just to prove to you that I'm not pulling a fast one on you, let's turn this live. Let's come back to Backtube and hit refresh. Howdy, MDS. I now have a whole different set of content as I'm cycling my way through here. So in that amount of time, I made a live round trip to YouTube and pulled down that content. I'm going to flip it back to my stock data but just wanted to show you what's going on. Now, I've got some things that handle pagination in here, next and previous and jump to and everything. I've got a helper in here that is going to point me to a couple of different templates. But I want to sneak down to this movie view, just so we can see all the pieces working together in concert. Now remember, my view is what's meant to render this information. And so there are a couple of different ways you can do this. When I have a movie view like this, and I give it a tag name, it's going to generate a bunch of LI items. You now know how my movie list is implemented. It's an unordered list with a bunch of LIs inside of it. Again, if you don't believe me, that hurts my feelings. No, if you don't believe me in here, here's the unordered list, that movie list. And notice I've given it an ID of movie list. But what we're looking at inside of here are each one of the individual movies that are going to get constructed at LIs that are going to get injected into that UL. Are you with me? Yeah? Great. So in the constructor, I've had the ability to say, all right, if you pass me in a template, great, I'll use that template. But if you don't specify otherwise, I'll default to a movie grid template. So what this is going to do inside of the render function is it's going to grab the template that we're looking for, and it is going to append the JSON and the template to this element. And in this case, this element is just a detached LI. Let's come back to index and look at that template. We shrunk this stuff down, but now we can expand it back out again. Here's this movie list template. It's going to come in an article, and you can see what we're doing here. We've got plug points in here for the ID. We've got plug points in here for the thumbnail and the title and the description. So this is how my movie list template is getting populated. This is my movie list template. If I wanted to see how the grid template was getting populated, we can see that this is nothing more than an image. So all this is going to be is an image. Like that. If I wanted to have a text-only view of this content, here's my movie text-only template. That's all I have is the title. So coming over here, do you see how I have 3 different views that are all rendering the content in a slightly different way? Yeah. So coming back to this once again, I have a model that is pure data. I have a collection that's responsible for making that request, populating these individual movie elements. And after that asynchronous request is complete, I am able to throw an event. What event is that? When I have this movie list view, when my collection throws the reset event, that's when I'm going to call the add all method. So I know I'm being fairly circular about this. I'm just trying to show you all these different pieces because there are a lot of different moving pieces. It's not nearly as complex as you might be feeling right now because we have a model and a collection and a template, and all these things are kind of tied together. But seeing how they're tied together, seeing that when that AJAX request is complete, it's going to throw a reset event. And when that reset event is thrown, I'm going to call add all. And add all is going to each its way through that collection and call add one. And add one is going to new up an individual movie view and append it to the element and return. Notice that this movie list view is tied to a specific element. This movie list view is bound to an ID named movie list. So I have a major view that has minor views. I have a collection that has models. And all these are interrelated. Yeah? Excellent. That is Backbone in a nutshell. Now, everything else that you're going to do from this point forward are going to be simple variations on a theme. For instance, if you wanted to deal with pagination, right, only returning a specific number of elements at once, let me come back in here, and I'm reasonably trustworthy of the internet connection at this point, so let me come back and make that request live. This is what that RESTful request is going to go for. It's going to go to most popular. It's returning the content as JSON. I am using JSONP to get these kinds of things. But by default, it's only going to return 25 of those items. If I want to do next, all I'm going to do is I'm going to append a start index and the number of items per page onto the URL. I'm going to give it a start index. In order to do previous, I'm going to do a start index, but I'm going to decrement that index with a minus instead of adding to that index. So what we have are a series of links that are going to call next and previous that is going to generate new AJAX requests that's going to paginate these things. So I'm on page 1 right now. Page 2, oops, let me do a refresh here. There we go. So when I hit page 2, that's the next set of values and the next set of values. Oh, that looks interesting. I better move on. All right. So you can tell this is live. I would never... Oh, and of course now it's stuck on that one, isn't it? All right, there we go. All right. I'm going to get kicked out. But you begin seeing now what's going on is I already have all the HTML in place. I already have all the templates. I already have the models and the controllers. It was able to do things that quickly because all I was getting back was JSON and JSON and JSON. I have the entire app locally here. The only thing that I am remoting is my data. Yeah? Now, I've been spending all of my time in a desktop browser. I wanted to show you that this stuff would still work in a mobile-sized application. And just to prove that, we'll come in here once again. That looks terrible. What happened? I should be moved in. I apologize about that. The live demo gods are definitely not happy with me here. But this is the same content going on in a mobile device. Obviously, I have some styling issues I need to work through there. But this is what we're getting out of this. Because this is client-side, I can now have my mobile device making all that same request rendering that I can on a desktop. I can have a smart TV, quite literally a Samsung TV, making that same request. So by moving all of this information to client-side, by dealing with HTML5, by doing it in JavaScript, I now have an app that runs on mobile, tablets, desktops, and smart TVs by moving all of that logic down to the client. Yeah? Excellent. We covered a lot of ground here. But this is what Backbone brings to the party. Remember what I said. Backbone is a single-page, client-side, component-oriented, asynchronous MVC framework. If you come back and join me for Jquery Mobile at the end of the day, Jquery Mobile is a single-page, client-side, page-centric framework. So the only difference between these two is whether you like the idea of having individual components scattered about your page, or you like the idea of moving from one page to the next to the next. You'll find that Jquery Mobile gives you things like page headers and footers. You'll find that Jquery Mobile gives you things like page transitions. The two are more alike than they are different. As a matter of fact, you'll find people very commonly using Jquery Mobile to handle the page transitions, and then using Backbone to handle the components inside of these. So there is not a reason in the world why you can't mix together Backbone and Jquery Mobile. I'm going to discuss them separately so you don't get them confused. But does this help you get your arms around what Backbone really has to offer? Yeah? Did you enjoy yourself? I did as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention.